How you been?
Very well, thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome, Brother Kareem, and all those who care to join with us for today's discussion. May it please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to join us as well and to grant us clarity of thought as we approach what we're approaching. It sounds like a tremendously significant task, the revision of Islam. But, after all, who are we? Just a couple of old men on either side of the world here putting our minds together, trying to sort things out as best we can for each other and whoever cares to listen to us. But that's in fact what we're doing, and may it please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us not only his permission, but his guidance in this task. So, no, I have finally cracked the book that you recommended so many months ago, this Mohammad Mahdi fellow. And I'm really impressed. Thank you very much. I heard about him years ago, but I never had access to his material, and it just was kind of in passing. And I'm disappointed to hear that he passed away just a few years ago. But and as soon as I found that out, I made a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I might be counted worthy to shake his hand in the hereafter. That's how impressed I am, and I thank you once again for the referral, and I recommend that everyone crack the books written by Mohammad Mahdi in order to get with it, so to speak. I know that this Islamic revisionist movement has been going on for several decades, and it got sidetracked by the movement was called Islamization of knowledge, and I think they just went back to the same old traditional track. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they spent millions and millions and millions doing nothing, but allowing for very self-appointed, very important people to travel the globe and hang out in 4- and 5-star hotels and act like Mr. Big Shot. That's how I read it, and without very little effect on what's really taking place, except for a few. I've seen a few movements that actually expanded the purview of Islam beyond the traditionalist borders to be a bit more inclusive. Some of these involve perennialism, but some others involve the classical approach to education, which, there's nothing wrong with reading, writing, and arithmetic now, is there, in the liberal arts, which have all been excluded. Now, I read that the author, Shahrul, has mentioned that most of the traditionalists don't go beyond their traditional purview. They just keep on regurgitating the same text for 1,000 years now or more. And that doesn't sound very inventive or inspiring or intuitive or even rational, you see. This is what the Catholics did during the Dark Age and into the medieval periods before the printing press. You see, the only people who could read and write were those who were educated in the court system, and most of the people who were educated in the courts, the royal courts I'm talking about throughout Western Christianity, were under the auspices of the Roman Church. So they were all reading the same stuff until And I remember reading one history of the world which said most medieval monks didn't even know a New Testament existed. They were reading catechisms, you see, and the catechisms were, of course, under the authoritative house of the modulus in magisterium in the Vatican, you see, which advises the Pope, and that's borrowed from Babylon. Don't tell anybody. Anyway, um, their Pitar is the interpreter of the mystery. So what we have in Islam is pretty much the same phenomena. And I found out when I studied the history of Buddhism, that was pretty much the same thing that happened again. 300 years after Buddha died, the hated Hindu priests, particularly the Brahmins, which he despised, rewrote his text and then have been handing them down ever since. And with some innovations, of course, to include tantric sexual magic and all that sort of stuff. So what we have is the same phenomena. Mohammed Shahroo makes this very, very clear. Hey, this is blinders. Traditional Islam is just like a horse out in the field, harnessed to a plow with blinders on, and he can't look this way or that way. The next way, he's just got to go, keep on going straight. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if you're on the path of al-Islam. Nothing wrong with that. But from what I can see and come to terms with on my own, and in agreement now with what I've read so far of Mr. Shahroo, God rest him, is that, hey, this straight path that traditional Islam has gotten onto is one of tyranny. It's one of patriarchal tyranny, what the sociologists call neo-patriarchy. Okay. And I edited the papers on that when I was working at Islam. There were several. And this neo-patriarchy is a kind of chauvinism that that is preferential to the Arabs, you see. So what has been exported is a kind of modified Arabian position because it was modified by the Persians. Don't tell anybody. Um, that might make it to the pulpit or the minbar, I see, but usually people don't like to talk about that. So anyway, the Persians modified the Arabian position, and now we've got these Arab chauvinists out there parading around like proud cocks in the barnyard, saying, "Hey, Islam is ours." Now I say that advisedly. I read the papers. I edited the papers that established this while the Malay government was studying Islamism, you see. And I read the papers I edited the papers that were published and written by the secret police, by the sociologists who were assigned to help the police reform these Islamists that they caught who were terrorists planning to blow things up like, buses with innocent people on it. And in the name of Islam, by the way. And I read the papers assigned by those who were the religious specialist alim who were also assigned to the case. And they all agreed, hey, these guys were getting the Islamists, who were many of them coming from Indonesia and some other, minor Pakistan and other places. They were all getting their sources from and their education in their madrasas and their mind melding, how shall I say, information from these fundamentalist Arabic sources, which were primarily Wahhabi, you see, in origin. Now, this goes back to a long, long time, and what they're all saying is, hey, I read these papers 10, 12 years ago. I edited several of them, okay? And they were all saying, hey, this goes back to this terrorism, this Islamist position goes back to has its root in the early 200 years of Islam's development, you see, after the death of the Prophet. It doesn't have its origin with the Prophet or in the Quran. Everyone was in agreement with that. It didn't matter who the author of the paper was. And I edited about half dozen of them, from the police, from social workers, from psychologists, and from the imams themselves, you see, who were all working as a team to reform these young men who were misguided. All right. And I got involved in some of it, and I had some students coming to me who were tempted, trying to be recruited. They tried to recruit me as well, because I was a doctor up and I was living at the time in Al-Satar, and that's in northern Malaysia. And there were guys who were on the Thai border, and they were terrorizing people. And they thought, hey, this guy's a doctor. He may be sympathetic. And they tried to recruit me so that I could treat some of their wounded, you see, in the jungles. And I politely said no. You see, I was very polite because I didn't know just exactly what their intentions were. And of course, being a foreigner and a white guy in those areas, you could disappear quite easily, you see. Anyway, they all agreed that these terrorists had their origins of their Islamism, their political Islam, if you will, in the early development of Islam. This misguidance was already there. The application of what you call this religious warfare, you see, and the misapplication of jihad, you see, for political purposes was already there. So I read these papers, I edited them, and they were all in agreement, and they all agreed also across the board in other independent papers that had nothing to do with terrorism, written by socialists, by social studies experts who were working on their PhDs. They also examined the same body of people. They examined the students, the foreign students who were coming to Malaysia, and anyone who was from the Middle East was subject to this Arab neo-patriarchy chauvinism. And they said, Islam is ours. We got it right. Everyone else has got it wrong. Okay. So when I cracked Mohammed Shavrow's book, I saw the same conclusions there. And what's more is I was also happy to see this, because what he's done is what some of my superiors asked me to do. They wanted me to diagnose what the problems were, you see, and try to create an alternative research program to revise even Malay Islam. And their fellows decided my plan was impractical because I called for cultural revival. And they said, well, that's not practical. We're all going towards a new world order. So we can't revive these ancient cultures and go back to their roots. But there's nothing wrong with a strong foundation if you understand what the foundation is, you see. And people don't know what the foundation is. These Islamists don't know what the foundation is. So Mohammad Shahroo did the same thing I did as a doctor. Now, I'm a medical doctor, and so I look at the patient's body from a diagnostic perspective, and that's a bit of an investigator. You see, you've got to be a bit of a detective. Shahroo did the same thing, but he's an engineer, you see. So he took his engineering discipline and he diagnosed the structure, you see. I diagnosed the sort of the moving physiology. He diagnosed the structure. My God, you put both of these perspectives together, you got some dynamite there. It's going to blow up that old rotten bridge so we can build a new one. You know? So I was very pleased to crack that book. Thank you very much. Now, by way of that, I'm just saying that by way of introduction, because I have I want to share just a few of his opening statements, not by Muhammad Shahrukh, but by the author of the book who wrote the introduction. I've forgotten his name right now. But these are,
Christman.
yeah, Kreisman. I just want to read these. There's just a few statements, and then I want to ask your reaction to these comments because they're very, very significant. I read them for the sake of our listeners here. So just bear with me here. Now, Islam's interpretation of apostasy, al-Jihad, al-Qitl, were in fact not too different from the Islamist positions, and that the deviation from the spirit of Allah's book did not just come with the Islamist movement, but that it had occurred much earlier in history, namely during the formative period of Islamic scholarship. That's the first statement, and it's just a restatement of what I've just commented on. So let's see. The next statement I want to read for our listeners is this: politicized Islam is basically an invention of our honorable scholars who aimed at replacing the spiritual message of the book by a political ideology that pleased the authoritarian rulers of their times and mobilized the masses for unjustified wars and crimes against humanity. That's god awful. I mean, it's outrageous. Now, I want our listeners to really take that in because this is not a light matter. One more statement. We will show that struggle and fight in God's way has nothing to do with martyrdom, missionary activities, or warfare, and that Allah does not stipulate any legal punishment for apostasy. And that in Islam, there does not exist a concept of freedom of religion. There does exist a concept of freedom of religion. That loyal to the religion of Islam does not mean an exclusivist identity that eliminates all other attachments and loyalties. And that finally, Allah wants us to live in a peaceful existence of multiple identities. Well, this is not neo-patriarchy of the Arabs. Not at all. It's the exact opposite. So, with that introduction being given, dear brother, let me ask you how it is that this particular approach affected also and continued to affect the Golden Age and then thereafter. Because the reason I'm asking that we're at the end of our discussion of the Golden Age. So I just want to bring this up and continue the struggle against this kind of neo-patriarchy. How did it affect the Golden Age? And why does it remain, in the face of so many people attempting to bring the truth? You see, what's going on here? Are people just taking the easy way out? And every time they kiss the rug, they're just like an ostrich putting their heads in the sand. I mean, what's going on here, brother, from your perspective? What has Islam done wrong? What has the Ummah done wrong? All these hundreds of years, are they just being politically correct? Or is this some sort of expanded psychological phenomena that is described in Al-Quran as a spreading darkness? What's going on here? Because these people think the exact opposite, and they're just dead wrong. Inshallah. Help us to understand what happened.
Yes, thank you, Brother Omar, and for having me once again and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts with you and the viewers. Yeah, I'll get to that question. Just give me a moment or two to do my regular, usual dua. Right. So, what went wrong in Islam or with Islam? That was a question already asked by Bernard Lewis. He has an article on it. I'm not sure whether he converted the article into a book also. I mean, his thesis basically is that we didn't have enough freedom in Islam, and that was, he's probably partly right, like not enough freedom of religion, and no doubt about that. The one point I'd like to just mention is that I would perhaps put it slightly differently from the way
Hmm.
you put it at the beginning, that we are revising Islam. I would suggest that we could perhaps think of it as revising or updating or improving, rehabilitating our knowledge of Islam, because
Yes. Okay.
Islam, properly understood, doesn't need any revision. But has it been properly understood? You
Hmm.
see, this is the question. And I think the
Hmm.
research done by even by Sunni scholars seems to be indicating that we have not understood the teaching of Islam correctly. There has been some distortions, and these distortions, there are reasons for these distortions. Politics is, of course, a major one among them. What passes for knowledge in any given society is, of course, always affected to some extent by political pressures on the scholars, whether we live in a capitalist system like Canada or the US, or the communist system or the Islamic system. Scholars, of course, have always been under pressure from political authorities to conform to their narrative, and not to undermine this narrative. Let me just give you the example of Dr. The fellow who questioned the dodgy dossier about Iraq, who was found mysteriously, and it was alleged that he committed suicide. He differed from the official narrative, and he was saying that no, Iraq does not have weapons of mass destruction. So
Yes.
sometimes people are eliminated, literally, so to speak, if they are not
Hmm.
providing the correct narrative. And it happened.
Hmm.
There was a Quran-centric person in Bangladesh who also disappeared without a trace. Rashad Khalifa was murdered in the United States by some lunatics, members of Al Qaeda. And there are people like Mansas, a fellow called Mansour. He had to escape from Egypt to the United States also because the mainstream Muslims there did not like his Quran centric ideas. And
Hmm.
even today, we have Edip Yüksel shared with us that there
Yes.
have been actually 5 assassination attempts against him already. He
Is
survived
that
all of
so?
them.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And he even described one of them to us. He said he was about to give a talk at some event in Chicago organized by a group of Muslims, and then he hears a knock on his door. And there's a man, when he opens the door, there's a man who says to him, "Sir, I am from the FBI, and we have information that the group to which you are planning to give your talk has conspired to kill you during your talk. So we advise you to leave the hotel immediately and don't give the talk. We have an implant or a mole in that group, and he's the one who tipped us off." So he left immediately. But that's just one example of the kind of
Hmm.
risk that you put yourself at when you begin to express any kind of disagreement or difference of
Hmm.
opinion,
Hmm.
whether to the mainstream or to the orthodox opinion. I mean, we also have a case of that in Western philosophy, history of philosophy, in the form of Socrates, who was the dissident par excellence, and he was also
Hmm.
put on trial by the Athenians. And interestingly, one of his two crimes was he committed apostasy, you see,
Yes.
because he did
Right.
not believe in many gods, you see.
Yes. Right.
So from the Islamic perspective, that is probably a good kind of apostasy, but so it was
Yes.
halfway there, so to speak. Is La ilaha illallah. So what I'm trying to say is that politics has a tremendous impact on what is considered to be knowledge. So the scholars who are dedicated ideally to the truth always face this risk and have to struggle and present the truth in a way that, of course, puts them at minimal risk. Leo
Hmm.
Strauss, the leader of the former school of thought with which I associated for a number of years, has written a book called Persecution and the Art of Writing, and he writes in it that even in the Western tradition, many people could not openly express ideas that ran against the mainstream opinion. So what they would do instead is to because they would put their lives at risk otherwise. So
Yes.
they would hide their meaning in between the lines, so to speak, by writing in
Hmm.
a, what he called esoteric way. In other words,
Yes.
you had to decipher. So sometimes they would appear to contradict themselves, but only
Yes.
one of the opinion was the true opinion.
Hmm.
So this is a problem we are still facing today, and even
Hmm.
us who are trying to, rediscover the true teaching of the Book of Allah, face certain pressures. And we see this, for example, also in our discussions on Clubhouse, where we have some Sunni brothers and sisters who seem quite adamant, that we are wrong, and sometimes we are even threatened, and what
Hmm.
have you. But normally I take the view that, well, if you threaten me, I will threaten you back. So if somebody threatens me on Clubhouse, I will start to tell them about whether he or she would be interested in having a nice vacation in Guantanamo Bay, which is a fantastic resort. And even though they
Hmm.
may not provide, water skiing, they might qualify for some waterboarding. So that normally shuts
Yes.
them up. So,
Hmm.
qisas, or just retaliation, is permitted. And on that note, I would also like to mention that I'm not sure if I heard the quotation correctly, where Kreisman seems to say that the word jihad, or struggling in the way of Allah, does not include any kind of military action. Well, actually, it does, but it is a very restricted form of military action, because military jihad is restricted purely to self-defense. So Muslims are permitted and perhaps even required to defend themselves if they are under attack from external sources. So in
Yes. Of
that
course.
sense, but what the Quran does not allow is to go on the offensive, to become an aggressor. There are
Hmm.
clear verses in the Book of Allah where Allah says He does not love aggressors. So the moment any person becomes an aggressor and starts fighting an aggressive war, what we know has been termed jihad al-talab,
Hmm.
spreading Islam by the sword, at that moment, I think whoever participates in that has already lost support from Allah, and they are looking at
Hmm.
the long-term ruin, which in fact did happen. Almost
Yes.
every major Muslim empire was wiped out because it became aggressive. The Umayyads became aggressive in a certain way, and they were overthrown by the Abbasids. The
Hmm.
Abbasids became aggressive toward the Mongol traders and ambassadors, and they were also overthrown and finished. The Turks attacked Vienna twice, and they, wars of aggression, and they were also defeated, and the Turkish Caliphate basically disappeared.
Hmm.
Most recently, Saddam Hussein attacked two countries, Kuwait and Iraq, in wars of aggression. And what happened to him? I think you know the story. I don't have to
Hmm.
belabor that. So aggressors, and we have also in European history, what happened to the people who invaded Russia twice? What happened to Napoleon when he waged a war of aggression against Russia? What
Hmm.
happened to Hitler when he tried to do the same thing, wage a war of aggression, invading at the time the Soviet Union with 3 million man army, which was the biggest gathering of troops ever in history up until that time. He also lost. So aggressors always lose out in the long term. So now, in terms of whether the modern day terrorism has any roots in some traditional thinking, absolutely. The roots are not in the Quran, because the Quran prohibits this kind of thing. But if you look at the work of some of the ulama, specifically al-Shafi comes to mind, and it came as a
Hmm.
surprise to me as well, because al-Shafi apparently is one of the four the leaders of one of the four leading schools of thought, but he
Yes.
was one of the major scholars who actually adopted and preached the doctrine of aggressive warfare, spreading Islam by the sword, on the
Hmm.
basis of his acceptance of the doctrine of abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword. So
Hmm.
now, apart from the influence of politics on scholarly work, there's another factor here at play, and I don't want to comment at this point in time as to which is the stronger factor, but we have also another factor here is problematic exegesis, problematic tafsir,
Yes.
superficial, careless reading of the Quran. And that
Hmm.
has been used by Islamists to justify wars of aggression. And that was a very serious error. Now, this error, I think, can be traced to the original, I don't want to say original sin, but the original error, which was basically the discounting of rationality or reason
Yes.
in Islamic, religious sciences, because the moment people refrained and retreated from the use of reason, that's when the trouble started. And that was
Hmm.
also what started, I think, explains to a large extent this poor quality tafsir that we have from a
Yes,
number of traditional ulama. Let me give you just, let me give you at least one example. You see, I have already
please.
mentioned one or two examples. I have already mentioned how the ulama, the militant ulama, people like, Maududi and Said Qutb, misinterpret the verse which says that, refers to the Muslims as the Ummatan Khairan, the best community. Why? Because they do what in Arabic is stated in the following words: Amr bil ma'ruf wa nahyan al munkar. In other words, they, command what is good and prohibit or prevent what is evil or what is wrong. Now,
Hmm.
as Dr. Omar Ramahi, who is also an engineer, by the way, it seems
Hmm.
that the best works on Islam now are written by engineers. We also have a
Is that
fellow
so?
called Ali
Mm.
Ashgar, engineer, that's his name. And
Hmm.
we have, of course, Edip Yüksel is also an engineer by training.
Yes, he
So,
is. Yes. Hmm.
I mean, why do we get the best writing on Islam now from engineers? I would suggest the reason is that simple, because they have not been brainwashed by traditional Islamic education, you see.
Yes.
And they bring principles of logic and clarity of thinking, scientific thinking, into their, manhaj of
Hmm.
interpreting the Quran. And I think that is how they manage to think outside of the box of tradition. But anyway, to come
Hmm.
back to my example, as Dr. Omar Ramahi points out in his excellent book called, Muslims' Greatest Challenge, choosing between
Hmm.
Islam and tradition, he points out that the word nahi in that expression, nahyan al munkar, has been misrendered by militant ulama to mean, prohibit, and to mean prohibition, as if it was Allah's prohibition, tahrim. But the word nahi does not mean tahrim, it means to discourage. So you can
Yes.
discourage people without using force, but if you have to prevent people from doing something, you may need to use force. So when they, interpret the word nahi as prevent, then they are already giving a kind of militant, politicized interpretation to that verse.
Yes.
So, yeah, that would be one example. Perhaps I can mention one more example,
Please.
something that I also actually, Shahrur tipped me off on this, and I actually have to confess, I missed it on my first reading of that
Hmm.
chapter 6, where he talks about it.
Hmm.
And what he does there is that he gives the reasons or the arguments that the militant ulama have advanced for justifying the wars of aggression. And the one that I initially missed was when he said that the militants, Mufassirun, people like Maududi and Qutb, they basically take two verses out of the Quran. One is in Surah Luqman, where Luqman says to the boy, avoid shirk or associating partners with Allah, because that is a great zulm. The word zulm, from it comes the word zalimin, is normally rendered as wrongdoing, injustice, and what have you. It can also mean
Hmm.
trying to harm people. So now they say that first the Luqman identifies shirk with zulm, and then when they go to the verse 193 in Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah says that in the last part of the verse that there shall be no hostility except against the zalimin. You see. So now
Hmm.
here, what the way where the bad tafsir comes in, first of all, is in rendering the word udwan, which is the Arabic word used for hostility. They render that as fighting. There shall be no fighting except against the people who zalimin. And the zalimin here to them mean the people who are idolaters or who commit shirk. So
Hmm.
in combination, these two verses, the way they misinterpret them, they think it gives the Muslim Ummah the right to attack non-Muslim countries
Hmm.
just because they think that these people are fail to rule by the Sharia. In other words,
Hmm.
they are committing shirk by using man-made laws and what have you. So they think that
Hmm.
This gives them the right to attack, the non-Muslim nations, even when these non-Muslim nations stop fighting against the Muslims. You see,
Yes.
so this is one example of the very problematic tafsir, very problematic exegesis, and because of this carelessness, or maybe it is deliberate distortion, they try to justify these wars of aggression. I have a friend, by the way, on Clubhouse in the United States, and he told us in one of the rooms, and he talks a lot to different groups of Muslims there in the States. He's
Mm-hmm.
actively involved in this kind of work, and he says the majority of the people that he spoke to, the young men especially, they
Mm-hmm.
believe that this jihad al-talab is actually valid,
Yes.
and it is should be carried out. In other
Yes.
words, fighting against non-Muslims just because of their unbelief, not because they are attacking the Muslims, you see. So that is
Yes.
no longer
Mm-hmm.
war fighting in self-defense. That is a war of aggression,
Yes.
which is prohibited. So the real pity is that the ulema, and for instance, al-Shafi'i and others, Ibn Hazm and a few others, have basically made halal what Allah made haram. Now, this is
Yes.
very, very serious. They
Yes,
made
it is.
wars of aggression lawful, and in other words, they made something lawful that Allah Ta'ala has made unlawful. So, I mean, who do these people think they are that they can do this kind of a thing? You
Mm.
see? So the origin of the wars of aggression, I mean, I have even referred to the war of aggression, the Jihad al-Talab, as a form of state terrorism. And why did I use that expression?
Mm-hmm.
Because this doctrine of Jihad al-Talab requires the entire community to go to wage war on non-Muslim or neighboring nations once a year,
Yes.
every year, even when these non-Muslims are not attacking the Muslims. So now, if that isn't terrorism, then I don't know what is, you see.
Yes.
So I know it sounds harsh, but please, I challenge anyone to correct me, if what I'm
Yes. Yes.
saying is an
Let
exaggeration.
me stop
Yeah,
you just a minute, dear
sure,
brother.
go ahead.
This once a year business. Can you elaborate on that? Where does that come from? Why once a
Okay.
year?
Yeah, because they have raised it into a sixth pillar of Islam, and there's
Uh,
an excellent paper online. It's written by Hamid Mavani, that's
mm-hmm.
Mavani, and he among other arguments or points, he highlights this, that this was made into a sixth pillar of Islam, something that is required, like praying and paying zakat and doing fasting, you
Mm-hmm.
see.
Mm-hmm.
So, and by the way, there's another publication online. It's called Tackling Takfiri Theology, published by the Quilliam Foundation. You
Mm-hmm.
can find the full book on academia, and the authors are Salah Al-Ansari and Usama Hasan. Usama Hasan
Mm-hmm.
writes sometimes for the Guardian newspaper. So they make the same point, and in fact, they say point blank that yes, Shafi and Ibn Hazm were among the people who basically endorsed this doctrine of jihad al-talab, or war of aggression. Now,
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, in 2007, Yusuf al-Qaradawi wrote a book called The Fiqh of Jihad, a massive 1,400-page book.
Oof.
But you can find, shorter, summaries of it online. I would recommend, for example, an article. If you Google what's new in Qaradawi's Fiqh of Jihad, you will come
Mm-hmm.
across a couple of book reviews written by Rashid Ghanouchi, plus another colleague of, Qaradawi. And you will find from this source, and by the way, this information was put up by one of my former colleagues. I know the fellow, he's from the same
Mm-hmm.
university. So basically,
Mm-hmm.
what they are saying, Rashid Ghanouchi also puts it quite well, that, the Yusuf al-Qaradawi is in that book. Basically, what he's doing is he's backpedaling on this whole notion of aggressive jihad. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, he's saying, but very softly, according to Ghanouchi, perhaps too softly, that these traditional scholars, basically, this was not a step in the right direction to approve
Mm-hmm.
this jihad al-talab, war of aggression, because there's no support for it in the Quran, none whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And this point of view is, by the way, also confirmed by Javed Hashmi, who recently in a debate, I mean, not so recent, the debate was about a year ago. There was a debate that he had with Robert Spencer, as you know, a well-known Islamophobe.
Mm-hmm.
And in that video, Javed Hashmi points out also that many of those contemporary scholars, most of the contemporary scholars, are basically rejecting this doctrine of wars of aggression, although there are still some exceptions. For example, there was a well-known Syrian scholar, his name was the Syrian scholar, he wrote that the holy concept of holy war is still valid on religious grounds. Syed Ramadan al-Buti was his name, and highly respected, at least by my former colleagues. I heard high praise about him from some of them. But he interestingly died in a bomb blast, in Syria. So I don't know, we have a saying in Canada, what goes around comes around. Was this a case of karma? But anyway, so there are some people who still believe in this doctrine of jihad al-talab. That's because they were basically badly educated, you see.
Yes.
And the traditional education actually needs to be revised, and people need to be allowed to think outside of the box. They need to be permitted to think and to express their points of view. I mean, if what the student says in the classroom is wrong, the teacher is there to correct him, you see. But if they are not allowed or permitted to express, their point of view, then what kind of education are these people going to get? So I would say, to wrap it up, I would say there are basically two, things that went wrong. Where it started with the depreciation of reason, the belittling of reason and rationality, and its subordination to tradition, right?
Yes.
Because the traditional Sunni scholars tell us that we have to follow even the weakest hadith, even when it seems irrational to you or to me. In other words, we have to give priority to the hadith. This is very strange, because the whole science of hadith, how can you develop any science without using your akal or your intellect? So intellect was good enough for them to classify all the hadiths, but after they finished this task, or so they thought, then are they going to throw reason and rationality under the bus? So that was one error. The second factor, because it led to a whole series of errors, and I think we touched on this in some of the previous videos.
Of
One
course.
thing led to another. There was a sort of like a chain reaction of causes and effects, which basically culminated in the promulgation of this doctrine of aggressive jihad. But of course, the other major factor, as we have discussed, and as Shahrur also, he expounds on it at length in chapter 6 of that book you mentioned. The other factor was political pressure, you see. So the caliphs wanted a reinterpretation of the deen, of the religion, that would allow them, that would make it lawful for them to, as it were, go back to their old ways of, these raids, ghazwa, as Shahrur calls them. But this time they wanted to do it under the cloak of spreading Islam. But the real agenda was a little bit different. It was territorial expansion and rapacity and taking possession of assets of other countries, you see, of other nations.
Yes.
So irrationality and politics were two of the leading factors. And perhaps I can just end on a note by saying that part of the irrationality, that irrationality manifested itself not merely in subordinating reason to tradition, but the next error was to treat tradition as not just higher than reason, but as even equal to, and later on even superior to, revelation. So the revelation itself was also subordinate to tradition, not reason
Yes.
only.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
tradition
We
became
touched
the,
we touched on that a
yeah, we
lot.
touched on that. So this is the problem with traditionalism, and Muhammad Abdu even refers to traditionalism in his book on Tawheed as a quote unquote disease, you see.
Yes.
And he writes how the scholars will only agree, with your methodology if you arrive at the same conclusions. But the moment you begin to sound different, they will dismiss you, and they may even, accuse you of apostasy. And like Shahrur points out, this death penalty for apostasy hangs like a sort of Damocles over the scholars.
Yes.
And he basically says this amounts the threat of death to the scholars, or whoever doesn't agree with the scholars, he calls it a form of intellectual terrorism. And I think he's right on the mark. This has to stop. In fact, I even had the thought that any scholar who declares another person an apostate, that statement should be treated as a death threat because in Islamic law, apostasy marries the death.
Mm-hmm.
So now in Canada, we have a law. I used to teach law, by the way, which says
Mm-hmm.
that uttering death threats is actually a crime. If I recall
Mm-hmm.
correctly, the maximum penalty is 12 years in prison. I checked with some friends from the US, and apparently it's a crime also in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So I think contemporary states should consider passing a law that anyone who declares another person as an apostate in Islam, that remark should be treated as a death threat, and that person should
Mm-hmm.
be basically charged with uttering death threats, and if
Mm-hmm.
convicted, given an appropriate punishment for uttering death threats against other people. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you something along the same lines, but a different approach. I've heard some mullahs um, put forth the idea: let's just invade the West passively. Okay, so we'll take advantage of their open immigration policies and get as many of our young men into the West, wherever into any of the European countries and into America, Canada, whatever, and then have them take as many wives as possible and produce as many children as possible. Is this also a form of jihad
Yeah, I
under
guess you
this
could.
kind of doctrine? You see?
Yeah, I guess the ISIS people had the concept of sexual jihad, but
Yes.
this taking over other countries reminds me of what a friend of mine told us in Clubhouse. He said that in the early days, he was a part of associating with the Hizb ut-Tahrir people in the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, he was quite, and this is not an uncommon story. Other people had a similar experience. Like there was a fellow, one of the people from the Quilliam Foundation also had a similar experience. But anyway, he said that these people were planning to, the Hizb ut-Tahrir people, they were planning to go and knock on number 10 Downing Street at a certain
Mm-hmm.
time in future when they felt, as it were, that was the right time to take over the United Kingdom for them,
Mm-hmm.
and how
Mm-hmm.
they were going to do it. They were going to do it by simply asking the prime minister to leave the house because they wanted to move in and take over.
Mm-hmm.
Can you believe this? They were just going to ask him to leave
Yes.
because he's not ruling according to principles of justice and what have you. So, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is this is absolute insanity. I mean, these people have lost their minds.
Yes. Yeah. They
So
have no
who in
perspective.
no perspective, none whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So anyway, that's just one example of how the level of thinking among some of these people is just incredibly problematic, brother. You know?
Yes, it is. This. It's. How shall we say? It's the development of their faculty of reason has been repressed. It's been arrested, and we use the term psychologically as arrested development. So, and I think that's an appropriate phrase that can be applied to a large portion of the Ummah. There's an arrested development as far as the faculties of reason is concerned, and this is not a good place to be um, in terms of here and hereafter. You see, because the hereafter depends on what we do here. Now, I don't want to get involved in magical thinking, that sort of thing, but we have certain indications in the Quran that there are penalties, and some of these penalties are rather severe, and they're of such a nature that they cannot be modified in the life to come. So there's now a lot of people don't like to think about that. They say, "Oh, my God isn't that cruel." I don't think Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, as far as I can read the scripture and the Sunnah of our source creator, I don't think Allah cares about cruelty. Um, I think that the evils, whether they're natural or unnatural and chosen by the children of Adam, you see, these are kind of all the same, and Allah, it's like water off the duck's back. It doesn't make any difference to Allah, but it does make a difference to us because there are certain laws in place that are absolute, and these laws can have different permutations in the present world, this prison planet, as Alex Jones puts it. You see, there's limitations here, and what goes around comes around, as you say, and this law of the karma, I think, is very real. But there's also an effect of our deeds that is everlasting, and if the ummah is arrested in their rational faculties, then that means they cannot make the correct decisions. And this is a dangerous place to be in, you see, because your decisions affect your deeds and the application of your will. And, well, that's subject for another another discussion, I think. So I want to thank you once again. I want to for sharing with us your profound knowledge base and experience in these matters. I want to pursue this concept of taqlid further and see if we can't apply it to different aspects of the Muslim approach to Islamic discipline, you see, that has gone off course. Because taqlid is something that means, well, it's just blind following. But if you discuss it further, then you find, okay, well, we're entering the realm of what Jung and others call the shadow, and what perhaps may be referred to in Al Quran as different parts of the human being using different names, shaitan, the iblis, or various types of jinn, if you will. These all have different personalities, and humans, as we know, also have different personalities and manifestations of different gifts. Now, if you're gifted by Allah, you see, you can also use these gifts for good or for evil. If you choose to use them for evil and you become conscious of that choice, and I've met some people who've done this, and they enjoy the evil, and it's great, and they say, "Oh, I'm going to rule in hell with shaitan." I have this magical thinking, and I say, "Okay, well, you go your way, I'm going my way in peace." But there are other people who follow them, and they don't make this decision, but yet they follow. Excuse me, they follow. You see, and this taqlid is what concerns me, because it seems to me that a large percentage of the ummah for 1,000 years has been subject to this kind of metaphysical, psychological following, you see. So they're blindly following these leaders who've made profound errors in the assessment, the original assessments of what Islam is and isn't. So, in order to assess this sort of thing with respect to taqlid, and what needs to be realized so we become conscious of it, is that, well, we have to then define what Islam isn't, you see. And so we're going into that, and you say, okay, well, this jihad al-talib is, this is forbidden. This is not Islam. Okay, so that's okay, and we've got that clear now. That is not al-Islam, and we've also defined, hey, the use of reason is halal. It's not haram, and they've made it haram. So this is not Islam. So we've also made that clear. You see, so I want to explore further other realms of taqlid besides just reason and jihad. What else have what other things have Muslims been following blindly and thinking is halal when in fact it's actually haram, you see. So, with that having been said, brother, unless you have something else you want to add before we close,
No, I think you've summed it up very well.
very good. Thank you very much, brother. Until next week, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.